The rain came down in sheets, a relentless drumming against the thatch roof of Alara's cottage. It was a sound that usually soothed her, a grey curtain that hid her from a world that had never wanted her. But tonight, it sounded like footsteps. 1,000 of them, marching in unison, closing in. She drew the rough-spun blanket tighter around the small boy curled against her side, his breathing the only steady rhythm in the room. Finn. She'd found him 3 weeks ago, a slip of a thing huddled beneath a gorse bush, all wide, silent eyes and shivering limbs. He smelled of pine needles and old fear, but underneath it, something else. Something like nascent starlight and untouched snow. He never spoke, but his eyes told stories of a terror she knew all too well. Her own past was a ragged tapestry of sharp-edged memories and the suffocating scent of an alpha who saw weakness as an invitation. She'd run, carving out this solitary life at the edge of the Blackwood, a place no sane wolf would claim. Here, she had her herbs, her quiet, and a fragile peace. Until Finn. Taking him in had been a risk, an act of foolish compassion that screamed at her survival instincts. But leaving him to the forest, she couldn't. Now, every snap of a twig, every howl of the wind, felt like a judgment coming for her. The packless were prey. And a packless nobody with a child who smelled of royal blood. She was already dead. A tremor ran through the floorboards, not from the thunder, but from the ground itself. Heavy, synchronized footfalls. Not one. Dozens. Finn stirred, his small hand clutching her tunic. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were wide with a prescient fear. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She rose slowly, her movements stiff with dread, and peered through a crack in the wooden shutter. Shadows moved between the trees. Massive, fluid shapes that resolved into the forms of wolves, their fur glistening in the intermittent flashes of lightning. They weren't the ragged, desperate rogues that sometimes hunted these woods. These were sleek, powerful, their movements a symphony of predatory grace. They formed a perfect, silent circle around her tiny home, their collective gaze a physical weight. 50 of them. Maybe more. And at their front, a man materialized from the rain-soaked darkness, as if born from the storm itself. The door didn't splinter, it exploded inward. The force of the impact threw a cloud of dried herbs and dust into the air, the scent of lavender and chamomile swallowed by the overwhelming smell of ozone, wet earth, and pure, undiluted power. The man who stood in the gaping doorway filled it completely, his presence sucking the very air from the room. He was enormous, built of the same unyielding granite as the mountains to the north, his wet black hair plastered to his skull, his eyes glowing with a faint, feral light. An alpha. Not just any alpha. The scent of absolute authority rolling off him was a physical blow, forcing the breath from her lungs and her knees to tremble. This was the king. His gaze swept the small, single-room cottage, dismissing the drying herbs, the meager furniture, the crackling hearth. Then his eyes landed on Finn, who was half hidden behind her skirts. A sound tore from the king's throat, a guttural mix of anguish and rage that shook the very foundations of the cottage. Finn, the name was a prayer, a curse, a revelation. He took a step forward, and the 50 wolves outside shifted as one, a low, menacing growl rumbling through the forest. Alara instinctively shoved Finn further behind her, her own body a trembling, inadequate shield. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. The king's burning eyes snapped to hers, and the raw fury in them scorched her to the soul. "You dare," he snarled, the sound more beast than man. "You dare hide my son from me and then command me. I will tear you limb from limb, kidnapper." He stalked forward, his hand outstretched not for her, but for the boy. "Come, Finn. It's over." But Finn didn't move. He burrowed deeper against Alara's legs, his small hands twisting in the fabric of her worn dress. When the Alpha King was only a few feet away, a tiny, fierce sound erupted from the child's chest, a desperate, defiant growl. It was the first sound she had ever heard him make. The king froze, his hand hovering in the air. His gaze flickered from the boy's terrified face to Alara's. Confusion warred with the rage in his eyes. A child who had been stolen, brutalized, and missing for months should have run to his father. He shouldn't be defending his captor. What did you do to him? Cale demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. What spell have you woven, witch? Elara found a sliver of courage in the boy's impossible bravery. I did nothing but keep him warm and fed, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I found him half dead from cold and fear. He was alone, lies, Cale spat, but the word lacked the conviction it had moments before. The evidence was right in front of him, in the way his son, his silent, traumatized son, clung to this waif-like woman, as if she were his only anchor in a storm. The standoff stretched, thick and heavy. The air crackled with the king's power and Alara's terror. Outside, 50 wolves waited for the command to attack, to rip apart the threat to their future alpha. Cale's jaw worked, the muscle ticking furiously. He could take the boy. He could snap her neck in a single, satisfying second. But that tiny, protective growl stayed him. It was a sound of loyalty. A sound of trust. And it wasn't directed at him. He finally lowered his hand, clenching it into a fist at his side. The concession cost him, his pride a palpable, wounded thing in the small room. He will not be separated from you, Cale stated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Not yet, his eyes were chips of ice. Therefore, you will both come with me. You will be under my guard until I have the truth of this. If you are innocent, he paused, letting the weight of his power press down on her, you have nothing to fear. But if I find you had any part in his abduction, the Blackwood will feast on your bones. It wasn't a choice. It was a decree. He turned and barked a command, and 2 of his wolves padded into the cottage, shifting into their human forms as they crossed the threshold. They were large, grim-faced men, their eyes holding the same cold fire as their alphas. They flanked her, their proximity a suffocating promise of violence. Elara looked down at Finn, whose face was still buried in her dress. She stroked his hair. She had no choice. For his sake, she had to walk into the lion's den. We will come, she said, her voice barely audible over the rain and the pounding of her own heart. The journey was a blow of fear. They didn't offer her a horse or a carriage, she was forced to walk, Finn held tight in her arms, his small weight a comforting ache. Cale walked ahead, his broad back a wall of rigid fury. The 50 wolves moved around them, a fluid, living cage of muscle and fang. They were silent, their paws making almost no sound on the wet earth, but she could feel their eyes on her, 50 pairs of glowing lamps in the dark, judging her, condemning her. The scent of them was overwhelming, a mix of wet fur, pack loyalty, and the sharp, metallic tang of redness. Her own scent, she knew, was a spike of terror and defiance, an open book for them to read. With every step, the trauma of her past clawed at her throat. The last alpha who had looked at her with such possession, such absolute authority, had left scars on her soul that had never healed. Cale was 1,000 times more powerful, his aura a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish her fragile sense of self. A strange, unwelcome current pulled at her, a faint hum beneath the fear that drew her eyes to the Alpha King's back. It felt like the inexorable pull of a river's current, and she hated it. It was a weakness, a betrayal of her own survival. She dismissed it as a symptom of her terror, a fawn's mesmerized fear of the wolf. The stronghold rose from the mist like a jagged black tooth, a fortress of dark stone and sheer cliffs that seemed to challenge the sky itself. It was a place of power, not comfort, radiating an aura of ancient, brutal strength. Compared to the warm, cluttered safety of her cottage, it was a tomb. As they passed through the massive iron gates, the pack members who had remained behind lined the courtyard, their faces a mixture of awe, relief, and suspicion as they stared at her. Whispers followed her like grasping hands. The kidnapper. The witch. Kale didn't slow. He swept through the castle, his boots echoing on the stone floors, leading them to a suite of rooms in the royal wing. They were luxurious, with a roaring fire, thick furs on the bed, and tapestries depicting legendary hunts. It was the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. A tall, severe-looking man with silver at his temples met them at the door. Kale's beater, Marcus. Alpha, he said, his eyes flicking to Alara with cold disdain. The boy is safe, for now, Kale bit out. He turned to Alara, his expression unreadable. You will stay here. You will not leave these rooms. Guards will be posted outside. You will be given food, water, anything you need for the boy. Do not try to run. He turned to leave, but Finn made a small noise of distress, reaching a hand out toward the departing king before seeming to think better of it, pulling it back to clutch at Alara's sleeve. Kale's steps faltered. He glanced back, a flicker of something, pain, confusion, crossing his features before the mask of command slammed back into place. He left without another word, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a final, booming thud. The sound of a lock sliding into place echoed in the sudden silence. She was a captive. That night, the fortress was too quiet and too loud all at once. The silence was heavy, punctuated by the distant sounds of a world she was no longer part of, the clang of the smithy, the calls of the sentries on the walls. Finn, exhausted by the ordeal, fell into a fitful sleep in the massive bed, his small body curled into a tight ball. But his peace was short-lived. A whimper escaped his lips, then another, his legs beginning to thrash against the silken sheets. He was caught in a nightmare, his face contorted in a silent scream. Alara was by his side in an instant, gathering him into her arms, rocking him gently. "Sure, little one, you're safe," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum. She began to sing a soft, wordless lullaby, a simple melody she'd learned from her mother long ago, a tune meant to calm restless spirits. Slowly, the tension eased from his small frame, his breathing evening out. He burrowed against her, his nightmare receding. She didn't know she was being watched until a shadow shifted in the doorway. Kale stood there, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He hadn't been able to stay away. The sound of his son's distress had been a physical summons. He had watched her, this supposed monster, tend to his son with a gentleness that made his gut twist. There was no deception in her touch, no artifice in the soft melody she sang. There was only care. He stepped fully into the room, his presence immediately filling the space. Alara tensed, her song dying in her throat. "He has these often," Kale said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, stripped of its earlier rage. It was raw, tired. "The healers can do nothing, it's not a wound of the body," Alara whispered, her hand stroking Finn's hair. "It's in his spirit." Fear leaves a deeper scar. Kale looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the exhaustion shadowing her eyes, the defiant set of her jaw, the way her hand rested protectively on his son's back. "Tell me," he commanded, but the word was a plea. "Tell me everything. From the beginning," and so, she did. In a low, steady voice, she told him of finding a small, shivering bundle under a gorse bush during a storm, of carrying him home, of the slow, patient weeks spent coaxing him to eat, of the silent bond that had formed between them. She left out nothing, except her own history, the part of her that knew why a child would be too terrified to speak. When she finished, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Kale hadn't moved. The suspicion in his eyes hadn't vanished, but it was now clouded with a heavy, troubled doubt. He was a king, an alpha whose instincts had never failed him. But his instincts were now at war. One screamed that this woman was a threat. The other, the one that watched her soothe his son when no one else could, whispered that she was the first good thing to touch Finn's life in a very long time. A frantic knocking at the door shattered the fragile truce 3 days later. Marcus burst in, his usual composure gone, his face grim. "Alpha, it's the scouts. They've found a trail. 5 of them, heading for the Broken Tooth Pass. It's him. It's Vorlag," a vicious snarl ripped from Cale's throat. Vorlag. A rival Alpha from the Northern Ridge, a brute who coveted Cale's throne and his lands. The name was a confirmation of his worst fears. This wasn't a simple kidnapping for ransom, it was a political move, an attempt to steal his heir and his future. And now they were trying to flee. "They must have realized we recovered the boy," Marcus said, his gaze flicking to Alara. "They'll be desperate. They might even try to get him back. Or silence the witness." The implication hung in the air, heavy and cold. Alara was the witness. She was the loose end. Cale's head snapped toward her, and his eyes, which had begun to soften, hardened again, but with a different light. Not suspicion. Not rage. It was a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. He had brought her here to be his prisoner, to be interrogated. But in that instant, her status changed. She was no longer a suspect. She was a target. "Double the guard on this room," Cale commanded Marcus, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floor. "No one enters. No one. I will hunt Vorlag down and bring you back his head." He moved toward the door, his entire being radiating lethal intent. But he stopped, his hand on the latch, and looked back at her. The air between them thickened, crackling with an unspoken energy. That strange pull she'd felt in the forest returned, stronger now, a resonant hum that vibrated deep in her bones. His gaze held hers, and for a heartbeat, she saw past the king, past the warrior, and saw the male, the protector, who was about to go to war for his child. And, his eyes seemed to say, for her. The thought was so terrifying, so alien, she immediately crushed it. But the feeling lingered long, after he was gone, a dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. The skirmish at the pass was brutal and swift. Cale and his wolves were a force of nature, a storm of claws and fury. They caught Vorlag's party before they could escape, but the traitors were desperate, fighting with the savagery of cornered rats. Cale took a deep gash to his side from a silver-laced blade before he finally ripped Vorlag's throat out, ending the threat for good. He returned to the stronghold not in triumph, but carried on a litter, his skin pale, a fever raging in his blood from the silver's poison. Panic erupted in the castle. The healers rushed to his side, applying poultices and chanting ancient rites, but the fever wouldn't break. The silver was deep in his system, a corruption that even his alpha healing couldn't fight. Alara heard the commotion from her rooms, the hurried footsteps, the hushed, frightened whispers. When Marcus appeared at her door, his face ashen, she knew. "The king is dying." The words were a death knell for the pack. Without their alpha king, they would be vulnerable, and the political vultures would descend. But for Alara, the words struck a different, more personal chord of terror. She pushed past the beater, ignoring his protest, and ran to Cale's chambers. The room was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and ineffective herbs. Cale was thrashing on the bed, his eyes glassy, muttering incoherent words. The gash on his side was inflamed, a venomous black spreading from its edges. The healers backed away as she approached, their faces grim. "The silver poison is too strong," one whispered. "There is nothing more we can do. Get out," Alara said, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "All of you." They looked to Marcus, who, after a moment's hesitation, nodded grimly. He saw the same desperate certainty in her eyes that he'd seen in his alphas. When they were alone, Alara approached the bed. She knew this poison. She had seen it once before, in a rogue who had stumbled onto her land. There was only one cure, an old remedy using moonpetal and the caster's own life force. It was dangerous. It could kill her. She didn't hesitate. She took Cale's hand, and the moment her skin touched his, a jolt of pure energy, white-hot and blinding, shot up her arm. It was the bond. The fated mate bond, raw and undeniable, slamming into her with the force of a lightning strike. Cale's eyes flew open, and for a second, they were clear, focused on her. You, he rasped, a world of recognition and wonder in that single word. Then the fever took him again. Her hands went to his wound, ignoring the searing pain as the silver tried to poison her too. She closed her eyes, drawing on her own energy, her own life, and began to push it into him, chanting the old words, feeling the bond between them act as a conduit, a channel for her power. It was an agony and an ecstasy, her life force pouring into his, fighting the darkness, their very souls intertwining. The assault came at dawn. Vorlag's remaining loyalists, learning of Cale's injury, launched a final, suicidal attack on the stronghold, hoping to sow chaos and finish what their master had started. The fortress alarm bells tolled, a frantic, clanging cry. The 50 wolves, Cale's elite guard, formed a living wall of fang and claw at the gates, meeting the attackers with a coordinated, lethal fury. The sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the snarls of wolves, the screams of the dying, echoed through the stone halls. In the king's chamber, Elara was slumped over Cale, utterly drained, but the blackness of his wound had receded, his breathing deep and even. The fever had broken. He was sleeping, truly sleeping, for the first time in days. A crash from the antechamber startled her. One of the attackers had broken through the lines, a huge, scarred wolf with crazed eyes. He was after the king, to finish the job. But he saw her first. And beside her, huddled behind the bed, was Finn. The wolf grinned, a bloody, triumphant leer. Killing the Alpha King was good. Stealing the heir back was better. He lunged, not for the bed, but for the boy. Elara reacted on pure instinct. She threw herself in front of Finn, her arms spread wide. She had no weapon, no strength left. But as the wolf's claws descended, something deep inside her, something ancient and dormant, woke up. A pulse of silver light erupted from her palms, slamming into the wolf and throwing him back against the far wall, where he lay stunned and smoking. Cale's eyes snapped open at the sound. He was weak, but he was awake. He saw the attacker, saw Elara standing guard over his son, her hands glowing with a faint, residual light. With a roar that shook the room, he surged from the bed, grabbed the ceremonial sword mounted above the hearth, and drove it through the stunned wolf's heart. The battle was over. The 50 wolves had crushed the attackers. Silence fell over the courtyard, thick with the smell of blood and victory. In the aftermath, standing amidst the dust and debris of his chambers, Cale and Elara faced each other. The guards, the healers, the world outside ceased to exist. He was no longer just a king, and she was no longer just a packless stray. They were two halves of a whole, bound by fate, by battle, and by a love that had been forged in fire and fear. He still wore the bandages she had applied, and she was still covered in the grime of the fight, but they had never seen each other more clearly. "Your magic," he said, his voice rough with awe. "My mother's line," she answered softly. "It was said to be lost. I never knew." He took a step closer, his eyes tracing her face, seeing not a kidnapper, not a witch, but the woman who had saved his son, and then saved him. The fierce, resilient heart that called to his own. "I was a fool," he said, the words a confession, an apology. "My grief made me blind. I put you in a cage, when I should have been on my knees in gratitude. Can you forgive me?" Elara looked at Finn, who now stood beside his father, his hand held firmly in Cale's, his other reaching for hers. He was the bridge between them. "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "You were a father fighting for his son." Cale reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was no longer a brand of ownership, but a question. "I am your mate, Elara." "The bond? I feel it." "I know you do, too," she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "I will not command you," he said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, vulnerable. I will never cage you again. But I am asking you. Stay. Stay and build this life with me. Be my queen. Be Finn's mother. Choose us. Outside, the 50 wolves stood silent vigil in the courtyard. They were no longer her jailers. They were her honor guard, waiting for the word of their future Luna. Elara looked from the powerful Alpha King, who was offering her his heart, not just his crown, to the small boy who had already given her his trust. This wasn't the end of her story, the closing of a cage. It was the beginning. With a tear tracking a clean path through the grime on her cheek, she smiled. Yes,